Welcome to Survey Booker Sessions. Tune in to hear from people working in a range of industries and roles to provide you ideas that you can take away and use in your own business. I'm your host Matt Nally, the founder and director of Survey Booker, which is the leading CRM and survey management system for surveyors. So on this week's episode, we have Ian from Arc Consulting. So thanks for coming on, Ian.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Matt.
Do you want to introduce what you do? Because it's some fascinating stuff you do, but I think you'll do it more justice than I will.
Yeah, I'll try. So my name's Ian Boyd, and I work for an organisation called Arc Biodiversity and Climate. But within that and around that, there are quite a lot of other things going on. So essentially, it is an ecological consultancy, or at least that was the core of it, really. So we've done compliance ecology for the planning and development and construction world for years and years and years. But around that, because we all come from non-profit backgrounds, because we're all really interested in public realm, in particular public space, we've kind of incorporated in that work ideas around beneficial space for people that actually have high ecological function. How can you combine those things? How can you use ecological compliance to generate better places for people? And that's led us into all sorts of other interesting territories. One is called Art Ecology, which is an R&D unit department run by Nigel George here at Arc, and that really works with lots of universities, particularly on the south coast. And it's about what we call intentional habitat. So it's about deliberately constructing objects that are used in the built environment, either as retrofits or integral objects that have a habitat function. So that this is kind of, we do bird boxes and green roofs and green walls collectively as an industry, of course, but this is kind of pushing it on a bit further, especially in the marine environment. And then around all of that is a non-profit called the Common Space. And because we're a social enterprise, we use the time that we buy through the commercial work to then do lots and lots of free stuff around developing projects that are predominantly around kind of social, cultural, environmental, boosting, amplifying those kind of values in forgotten or neglected public spaces. There's a whole bundle of those kind of things.
Yeah, awesome. So I think the sort of three or four topics we'd like to cover today were based on some of the stuff you've talked about before, but buildings and biodiversity, I think we'll come on to first, then buildings and carbon, and then buildings and wellbeing. And there's some really interesting stuff you've touched on before, which I'm looking forward to delving into. I suppose around the buildings and diversity bit, what work are you doing at the moment? And I suppose how can new builds better incorporate the wildlife aspects? Because I know one of the things you mentioned in an article I read and a video I listened to is that buildings are becoming more and more difficult for wildlife and animals to nest in, like they might on older buildings, or find places to burrow in nooks and crannies. So what's the work you're doing around that to help new builds sort of be a bit more friendly and environmental in that respect?
I mean, there's a lot of advocacy going on, and of course, there are statutory drivers emerging very shortly. What's called BNG, biodiversity net gain, will be an obligation on pretty much all development. Small schemes will be exempt for a little while, and that will require that development demonstrates through a metric published by DEFRA that they provide some kind of uplift to biodiversity, the biodiversity component of the place that they're working in. And if they can't manage it, they have to buy offsets, and that is delivered elsewhere, off-site, somewhere else. And if they can't negotiate with a partner to do that, they have to buy statutory credit from the government, and so on and so on. So that kind of machinery is emerging. And that is very influential, and it should be encouraging new build to consider integrating habitats for wildlife as a matter of course rather than as a matter of exception. But it's kind of not really happening. So we are still stuck in terms of, let's say, residential and industrial developments, particularly, well, I'd say both actually, equally, to be honest. The appetite from the development community, by which I mean the agent, maybe the owner and the investor, just a lesser extent the construction team, to actually nail things to the surface of their perfect buildings, or to complicate the design as they see it by incorporating new structures, new objects that are colonizable in a conventional built setting, is still very low. And so we work with agents who still think that it's insane to encourage bats to inhabit people's houses because they'll fill their kitchens with with bats, and that no one really wants a bird nesting on their house. And of course, to some extent, they're true. But frankly, we've just got to get over ourselves. It's not good enough anymore. There's not enough time to mess about like this.
Yeah,
Bird
yeah,
boxes have been around for thousands of years, and we haven't moved on. We're still putting bird boxes up, and that's good. And we should, but they should just be um, entirely normal. Every single building should incorporate habitat. I mean, it's really that simple,
yeah,
and we're nowhere near that. BNG will push that a bit faster. Enlightened developers may do a little bit more in that regard. Um, but essentially, it's we're still stuck, where we've been for a very long time, which is trying to persuade a developer to put some swift boxes up, a critically threatened bird that depends in the UK anyway. Well, in England, perhaps there's a few cave nesters in Scotland, entirely on human habitation. That's the only place it can nest. And
yeah,
yet somehow we've got a battle development to get a Swiftbox put in. It's just feeble. To be brutal about it, it's not good enough. We spend much too much time celebrating really quite trivial interventions, sometimes quite
mm,
infantile interventions in the built environment. You can get an award for putting a beehive on your roof or something else, and it's just not really good enough. So
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
I think we really need to escalate very quickly away from kind of perhaps rather performative interventions for wildlife in the built environment into absolutely solid conventional way of doing things, which is that every built environment, every new built unit will incorporate a habitat for birds, a habitat for bats, a habitat for invertebrates, will integrate the landscaping choices that it makes around those such that they integrate, they provide sufficient food, forage, other kind of, so that you have a functioning ecosystem built around these new developments, and that's where we want to get to, and we're still not there, but that's what we need to do.
yeah. Out of interest, then, what does that utopia look like in practical terms? So, like, I know I've seen posts about like bee bricks and stuff like that, and you mentioned the Swift boxes that get built into the wall and stuff like that. But I suppose as you know, in an ideal world, right? Like right now, we're building a new build. What are the sort of options that would be good to build into that
Yeah,
property in terms
all
of
of them,
really supporting wildlife?
all of those. They're very
Yeah,
small, they're very cheap.
yeah,
In terms of the cost of a building, they are insignificantly tiny. Now, it doesn't mean that every building is appropriate, for example, for a Swift box. If it's a bungalow, forget it, there's no point. But you can put a house martin box up and they'll probably use it. You can put one of the integral bat tubes, I think they're actually called, where you sink it in. You can render over it, and it just has a little slot showing that the bats can actually roost into. And pips and brownies brown long-eared will use those kind of habitats, in small numbers. You may get a breeding roost in it. Of course, what we should be doing is constructing sort of loft spaces that provide that. But that's probably asking a bit much at the minute, unless it's a requirement in law. Of course, many of these are protected species. All of them are protected in one way or another. But just as without needing to be driven by law, the threat of prosecution, or an instrumental financial system that is calculating BNG, we should just be, as a matter of course, saying, well, I'm building a building. It's big enough for me to put a Swift brick in. It's big enough for me to put two house martin nest boxes up, or a swallow nesting platform, which is literally a plank. And I'll sink a couple
yeah,
of bat tubes into one of the elevations. It'll cost me, I don't know, 200 quid for that lot, probably less. So
yeah,
it's so simple. It's so simple. Now, of course, it doesn't mean if the building is made of plastic and glass, that's going to be harder. And it may be that you don't need a retrofit option, and then people get worried about the design and the aesthetic. And fair enough, an architect works hard on a building, and you then kind of nail a load of things all over it. Understood, absolutely.
yeah,
But right at the beginning of the design process, we
yeah,
need to be thinking, well, I am going to incorporate these things. It's just what I'm going to do, because of course, why would I not do that at a time of biodiversity collapse? So there are off-the-shelf, ready-made things, Matt, that you can just say, "Yeah, I'll have two of those, thanks very much," and they'll be there the next day, and
yeah.
off you go. It really is that simple. And then you spread into the landscaping around it, and as I say, you can do many other more imaginative things. But at least we'd be off to a good start with the basics. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose there's a couple of interesting points from that then. So the retrofit aspects, are they quite easy to install on older properties? And are there risks of, if you install one of those products, that it causes issues with, I don't know, damp or cold spots, or because I don't know how much people know about how they work or what the impacts might be,
Yeah,
um, more
I think.
generally. Yeah,
I mean, they're such small objects, and you can get very robust ones made in woodcrete, so they're sort of thermically very stable, for example. Um, and I think, in some senses, it's over to the development world to say, well, yeah, I understand the material it's made of. I understand my building back to front because I designed it. I can find a place for this. That's not a problem. And again, I think there's too much bumping this back to the conservation and biodiversity world, saying, well, prove to us that this isn't going to cause a problem. And there needs to be much more negotiated partnership between the development and construction world and, let's call it, the biodiversity industry. It is an industry, it absolutely is an industry. So that we're kind of finding shared solutions rather than just constant kind of bartering and negotiating. Well, can you put up 3 bat boxes? No. Can you put up 1? Well, maybe. And get it round and round. Do you know what I mean? And it's kind of
yeah,
infuriating because it's at a time when we need to be taking positive action together as a community of people involved in building things. And
yeah, yeah,
so I don't see that is an issue. I think given the specs on these objects and they are available, the development partnership, the architect can say, yeah, it's absolutely fine. It's not going to go there. That's never going to work, but it'll go there. And if
yeah,
none of that works, there are freestanding options. Now, I appreciate that a private garden is probably not the place for a Swift tower, but an industrial commercial development absolutely is. So
yeah,
there is always a solution for wildlife in the built environment, always, without exception, always. What we need to do is to accept that we are going to do something. We are not going to do nothing. We're going to do something, and then find the correct balance in there. But always, in the end, recognizing that we are going to do something. This is not negotiable. At the moment, it is negotiable, but we kind of need to have a mindset in the development and construction world, and I've been in it for 30 years, where it's just not even an issue. We're going to do this. Of course, we're going to do this.
yeah. There's certainly a sense, I think, at times where there's a narrative of we need to do things, but provided it doesn't affect my day to day. Why are people hesitant to incorporate these things? Like, what is the barrier to, to
Yeah,
putting in a bird box, or because it also, as you say, on the face value, it's very simple. So
yeah.
I suppose what's the hesitance?
I think because it's seen as an intrusion, the development world runs on very, very conventional lines. So you can have
Mm,
a spectacularly innovative or unusual design or development brief, but in the end, the development process, the way the contracts work, the way the programming of a development works is incredibly conventional. The way the manco is set up, the way all
mm,
of these things are still stuck in the way that they were 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ago. So one of the problems is you can have perhaps a planning authority or a private client or a commercial client saying, yeah, I really want to be ambitious. But by the time it gets farmed through that very tight, very tightly financially regulated, the nightmare of programming on any development anywhere, everyone's stressed, that the idea of introducing even the smallest thing that looks or feels different is just, I can't be dealing with this now. We'll come back to that. And so very often you'll see things that are conditioned for much later intervention. Very often there's no enforcement. They never happen anyway. So it is a transformation that needs to take place. But we are a sophisticated species. We build sophisticated buildings. We use modern materials. We're going to talk about carbon and things shortly. The the idea that we can't incorporate a box in a wall is insane. Of
yeah,
course we
yeah.
can, or of course we can. And so we just need to be a little bit braver. It's not even bravery, is it really? Just need to make that decision. Um, that we're going to do it. But that needs to happen at every level. It's no good handing down a whole load of perhaps poorly thought through prescriptions down to the team on the ground who then say, what is this? What am I supposed to do with this? It's got to be thought through properly. It can't just be performative. It can't just be superficial, fucking stuff about, get an award, and too much of that as well, I'm afraid. It needs to be properly built into the way that a project is designed and the way it's going to be built with the team involved who are going to be building it. So they are partners in this process. They don't just get a bit of paper with a thing they don't understand written on it. And
Yeah.
we're really important to work with the on-site construction team, the manco, the maintenance crews that are going to come in afterwards, because they're the folks who actually know how a place operates, really.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
involving them as early as possible, saying, look, this is, we really want to do this. What do you think? How do you think we can make this better? Is part of what we need to do much better than we do at the moment.
Around the ongoing maintenance then of buildings with these types of products built in, are there different things people need to consider around the sort of facilities management aspect if you've got bats in place or swifts or that type of stuff, or is it sort of business as normal?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, choose a site where it's not going to be an issue. Don't put a house martin nest box over your shiny new commercial entrance because, although it's very dry, house martin droppings are full of dead gnats. You probably don't want that raining down on your customers. So just
No.
think about where you want to put it. Think about a place where you're going to put it. They're incredibly discreet. The number of houses we have been, the number of development projects, redevelopment projects we've been to, where you say, well, we're going to need to do a bat survey. Um, as part of the normal work. Oh, really? Well, I can tell you now, I've lived here 30 years, there are no bats. We've got no bats. So, well, nonetheless, we have to do this. It's kind of a requirement of planning law that you submit this. And lo and behold, there's a pipistrelle roosting there that's been there for 30 years and they did not. And this happens all
Yeah.
the time. So this idea that people will be aware, will notice the presence of wildlife is wrong. They won't. But
Mm.
nonetheless, wildlife will be present. And therefore, this leads to really important stuff about engaging people with their local environment. So
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
bringing wildlife closer to the places where we live and work, the opportunity to engage with the natural world becomes much simpler, much stronger. There are enormous numbers of there's 30 years of research on the well-being and public health benefits, human health benefits of a closer encounter with the natural world. Doesn't matter whether you believe that or not; it's just true. It doesn't matter that you don't have to identify the stuff. This isn't a task. Just being in proximity to functioning ecosystems is good for us because we are, after all, living things. We forget that we are part of that ecosystem. So there is an important dynamic to this that you don't have to put things in a very paint it red and stick it on the front door. No, it can go in a discreet place that works and you will not notice it. But you will notice it once you start looking for it. And that is a
Yeah.
positive thing that we need to be moving towards. So I honestly don't think there are any real issues, Matt, with installing habitats for wildlife into the built environment. There are hundreds of superficial barriers we have erected in our minds that mean that we kind of constantly find reasons not to do it. We need to sweep all them away. BNG will help with that, but it's not enough. We just need, as an industry, to say, no, we're going to change because we can. And who else has got the opportunity to design and build new habitats for wildlife? No, there's not
Yeah.
really many other folks. I can tell you, I've worked for Wildlife Trust, RSPB, and others. There's they're not in a position to do that very often. They may be managing habitats that already exist to optimize them, but to design and build completely new features for wildlife that are also pleasing for humans, what a gift, but we're not
Yeah.
using it.
You're right. There's big opportunities there, and I think I agree that or many of us are very disconnected from nature, wildlife, and the environment and what's going on, and it can very easily be seen as a narrative on the news. Like it's raining. It has been raining here for quite a lot of summer. But meanwhile, there's massive wildfires going on in Europe. But it's a narrative in that respect. So it can be hard to feel that connection and understand it. I think sometimes. I, I think I'm looking forward to coming on to the well-being aspect with buildings in a second. Before we do that, my last question I think around the biodiversity aspect is I believe you worked on a project, new house building project on the Isle of Wight from an article I read. Um, from being involved in that, what benefits did you see come out of that? I think whether it's if, from what customers said once they moved in or whatever in terms of the the changes in that development versus a bog standard you know development with no aspects built into it around
Um,
biodiversity.
so, I mean, we've worked on hundreds, so I'm not sure. It may be that's
Yeah,
um, maybe the freshwater project. There was a. I can give you. I can
might have
pick
been.
an
Yeah,
example. But
yeah, yeah,
so I mean, so we've seen developments come and go for the past 30 years on the island, and tried always to intervene and incorporate the sort of things we're talking about more and more and more. The opportunities to do that are certainly increasing, but very slowly. Where we've been able to do these things, and sometimes that's been through particular client groups. So, for example, housing associations. Now, housing associations are really, really interesting because they own, well, let's pick a project where they do own everything. So they own
Yeah.
every brick, they own every blade of grass, and therefore all of that, every bit of that estate is relevant to their business model. And their business model is people who are happy and healthy, and there are no voids. Everyone's able to pay their bills or manage the process of paying those bills. So they are increasingly, the more progressive ones, looking at every brick and every blade of grass and saying, well, why aren't we using that to make a place that's happier and healthier than it was before? Because that is supporting our business model. Very, very interesting, because it's very much the same as the investment community and the ESG world. It's kind of shifting around that kind of axis as well. But housing associations have been in that mindset for a long time. So housing associations may say, well, we can, because we own everything. We've got big communal blocks, we've got communal buildings, lots of developments do. Public buildings, therefore, are also very interesting. We're going to put a whole bunch of Swift and Swallow and House Martin boxes, and in one development with a housing association did exactly that, was put Swift bricks in every property, every single property. And it became a talking point, so that people would say,
Mm.
now, I don't think Swifts have yet moved in. Swifts are, one of the problems we've got with Swifts is they are very site faithful. Once they go from a site, getting them back is really hard. So we did a project on the mainland where we actually worked with an amazing man called Will Nash, built a freestanding Swift nesting tower, but you have to play a lure when Swifts are
Ah,
passing through to draw their attention. And even then, it may take 1, 2, 3 years. It's a long job, which is why it's so urgent to put these things in now. It may take
yeah.
2 or 3 or more years to actually find these things. But other stuff will use it in the meantime. And that may be a problem in the future. It may not be a problem. That's why we need to put lots and lots of these things. But there was a blue tit in one. There was a pied wagtail in another. There's clearly visible wildlife activity. People taking photos of a blue tit chick sticking its head out the hole. And of course,
Mm.
it's delightful. Everyone loves that kind of stuff. And it became something, and still is, to talk about. And the idea of perhaps a little bit of competition. Well, I've got blue tits nesting in mine. What, why haven't you? Are you putting food out for them in the winter or whatever it might be? There are better ways than just feeding them in that way. Provide the landscaping that will feed them. That's the answer to that one. So yes, we have absolutely seen evidence where a client who is determined to maximize the value of these kind of interventions for their own business model, which in this case requires people to be happier and healthier than they might otherwise be, will enthusiastically adopt these techniques. They're very simple, very basic, very cheap, and then continue to work with that to encourage debate and to encourage discussion, discourse around this project that's happened in the vicinity. So it's not just built and forgotten because it's done its job of getting through planning permission. It becomes a live thing, and it becomes something that people can adapt and can change and can improve. So it adds a common conversation that everyone can take part in, because everyone in the end likes wildlife. There are very few people, I don't think I've
Yeah.
met, okay, I've met very few, I have met some, who just hate wildlife. And it may be for a very particular reason, um, which might be business or psychological in some cases. Most people, the great majority, love wildlife. So, of
Yeah.
course, bringing wildlife into a place is a entirely positive thing if we talk about it in that way and encourage engagement so that people feel they have agency around this too. What can I do to make it even better than it is? Well, here's some ideas. So it works. It works. It works for people and it works for wildlife. But it needs to be moving faster, moving harder. We need to think in an integrated way about the buildings and the surrounding landscape and their management and maintenance. Absolutely crucial. You can put all this stuff in and then have a terrible maintenance contract that just brings it right down to the lowest possible level of ecological function. And you might as well not have bothered. So
Yeah.
management needs to change as well. That's a whole other discussion probably, but that is super critical, needs to be thought through at the beginning. So there's a lot to do, but the tools are cheap, easy and immediately available. So it's not that hard.